Hello, welcome to the Mighty Underdogs podcast. My name is Armando Ojeda, and here with me is a friend and colleague who plays many roles. He is a serial entrepreneur, he's a marketing expert, he's a thought leader, he's a podcaster in his own right, and a book author. And he has a new book out called Do Less and Sell More. Counterintuitive for sure, but how entrepreneurs are building seven-figure businesses without breaking the bank, working like dogs, or losing their whatever. Anyway, here's Tom Nixon. Hello, Tom.
Hey, Armando. I'm so used to being on the same side of the proverbial soundboard as your co-host on this and other podcasts. This is unusual to be the guest, but I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you.
And real quick note on that last word that you omitted from the title.
Yes.
You read all the way to the end, right? To find out that is not an expletive. It's actually an acronym for the lessons in the book. Remember?
Ah, yes. That's fair. Very good.
All
so I want to talk about the book because there's some very, very good lessons. I've read it myself and my wife has read it also. And so there's a couple of elements in here about, entrepreneurs want to do everything ourselves. And we think by working harder, we're going to make more. So tell me how you're helping people to shift their thinking so they can actually be more effective in what they do.
Yeah. It's true. It's in our nature as entrepreneurs to kind of jump around and do this and do that and try this. And if that fails, then I'm going to try this. And the problem that presents from a marketing standpoint is there's no momentum and there's no consistency. And it's really challenging these days as more and more communications channels have opened up over the years. You would think that would make things easier. And at first it did, because it sort of democratized the communications platforms that were at one point owned by big publishing houses and whoever had the printing press and the largest circulation, and all of that changed, which I spell out in the book. And at first things got, like I said, easier to communicate with constituents. The problem though, is that continue to evolve is now we're in a media landscape that there is so many competing channels, so many competing messages, that people are overwhelmed. And to the point that they're tuning out. So if you're like a typical entrepreneur and you're jumping from this to that, there's no stickiness to it, right? Because people need the old truisms of advertising where people need to hear things 7 times before they hear it the first time. Those things are all still true. But if you're sort of playing whack-a-mole with your marketing, that, you might hit the mole one time and then you're going to miss the next time. And it's not an effective approach anymore.
Well, you mentioned in your book about you have one very, very effective marketing element or a tool, right? But so most people, myself included, want to do like the big blast across all of the social media platforms, on our website, maybe do some traditional PR, all of that. But what you talk about is really talking to your customer very directly. Talk about that.
Yeah, right. Well, what you're describing is what I coined as the term FOMO, which people are familiar with FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. But the way I'm coining it is not fear of missing out. It's the fear of marketing omission. In other words, if I'm not everywhere, then I'm going to miss some golden opportunity that exists. And had I just been there at the right time, I would have gotten it. So what they do is, and again, I should probably point out that I'm speaking to entrepreneurs and small business owners. I'm not talking about the behemoth companies that have budgets and personnel to do everything, because for those people, doing everything is just fine. It's completely manageable. It's completely affordable. But for the rest of us, it's not. It's not affordable to do everything effectively. And it's not manageable. So going back to FOMO. So if your fear of marketing omission has you doing one of two things, or either one of these things is going to lead to failure. The first is I'm afraid of missing out or omitting a marketing channel. So I try to do a little bit of everything. Again, if you're doing this yourself or you have a small team, a person doing your marketing for you, there's no way that they could do all of that effectively, nor is it even important to do all of those things because your audience probably isn't on every single channel under the sun. Come back to that. The other thing it does for the people who get this paralysis because of this analysis of this all these marketing channels, it becomes so overwhelming that they decide to do nothing. And they just kind of retreat into their comfort zone, which is, how did I build this business as an entrepreneur? Well, I pounded the pavement, I worked the Rolodex, and that's just fine. And that is just fine when you're a stage 0 or stage 1 company. But as you evolve into a stage 2 company, you have to move out of a sales mindset and more into a marketing mindset. And so doing nothing from a marketing standpoint brings the predictable results. Trying to do everything produces roughly the same results.
Yeah.
So my formula, I think, is that what you were asking about?
Yes, sir.
So instead of doing everything, my simple formula is this. It's 1 + 1 equals everything. In other words, your entire marketing program consists of 2 elements. One, which I say is a non-negotiable, and people always overlook it, it's email. It's been proven to this day to be the most effective communications platform from an ROI standpoint. We'll come back to that maybe. And then the other one is a single channel. So everything else that's out there, the book tries to create a pathway for you to figure out what is going to be the most effective way to get in front of my ideal client, the most consistent way, to the point where I'm not doing everything. I'm doing one thing. And not only is it manageable, it's super effective.
But so that implies that you really know who your client is and what media channel they are using. So you know that your client is on email, right? Because we're all on email at least 6 hours a day.
That's right.
But, then where else is the client? They're not everywhere. So where are they? But it really means that you have to know who your client really is.
Yep. And that's the roadmap that's in the book. It takes this methodology of who, why, where, what, how, and then ultimately when. The who part's the most important thing, because when I ask an entrepreneur, who is your ideal customer? What I hear most often is, well, it could be everyone. That is the worst thing. That's the worst way to answer that question. It's not everyone, right? But going back to fear of marketing omission, we want to broaden our reach so we're more inclusive of as many types of people as possible, when really the reality is there's a very specific, narrow audience that you need to identify first, to your point, and then focus on, to the exclusion of everything else. And you have to have that confidence. And I reference the book as being a permission slip to do less. You have to give yourself the grace, and you have to earn the confidence that comes with going through this process to saying no to things. One of my favorite books is a book called Essentialism by Greg McKeown, I think is how you pronounce his name. And the line that I keep coming back to is, he says, when you say no to something, you are saying yes to something else. And that something else is probably where you should be focusing your time, your passions, and your resources.
Right. And so let's go back a little bit to the client, because if you have the right client, then you can say no to all of these other things that come your way. So I work with another marketing person as well, and she says to describe 20 things about your client. So you actually know them intimately to the point where you actually can have a conversation. But then the conversation is, and you point this out in the book, is that, you have to see things through their eyes. What is their pain point, and what is your company doing to solve and relieve that pain?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So the first part of that is, coming up with the 20 things is what the fancy pants in our industry call the demographics and the psychographics. The demographics are things like, how old is this person? Do they tend to be male or female? That might not matter. It may matter. Do we know anything about their disposable income? Because you want to know, are they bargain hunters or are they premium shoppers, right? So that's important. All of those things. Age, geographics is another part of demographics. Are we trying to market to everyone, or are we marketing to just people in our own back door? All of those things. These are things that you can write down about your ideal client. And then that second piece is what they call psychographics. And those are the whys. That's the motivators, the demotivators. When you understand truly who is the narrow niche that you're targeting, you can understand things because, for one, you might know them intuitively, but you can also ask a handful of them, what keeps you up at night? You know, we've been working together for a while. Why, when you went out looking for someone like me, what problem were you trying to solve? What was the pain point? Was it a pain or a gain? It's Brian Clark's words. Pains are things that, are hurting, and pain, as Sandler would suggest, is the single greatest motivator, pain today, for a purchasing decision. But gains are also things. I wish I could, or, these aspirations that some products and services help people achieve. Sometimes it's both, like weight loss, right? It's the pain that I know I'm unhealthy, and it's this aspirational, I can see me thinner and more fit in the future. So the problem, and then I'll shut up for a minute. The problem that most marketers create for themselves is when they're drafting their marketing language, their messaging on the website or in brochures or in advertising or on social media, they're looking in the mirror. They're looking in the mirror and saying, what's so great about me? I'm going to tell the world what's so great about me. And the problem is nobody cares about what's so great about you. They care about what's so great about them or what's not so great about themselves. So the metaphor I use is turn that mirror that you're looking at, turn it into a window. Look through it and see on the other side that ideal target market, and go back to the psychographics that you listed in terms of their motivators and demotivators, and use that language. Don't talk about yourself, talk about them, or talk about the pain, and put them as the hero in the journey.
Right. And one of the things I counsel my SCORE clients, and I know that you mentioned this in the book, is actually going and talking to your clients, asking them questions. What is it that you liked? What didn't you like? What prompted you to buy this? And really use their language and their story and put that out there.
Yeah. There's a trick, a secret that I'm going to reveal to everyone. How you figure out what motivates your ideal market. Are you ready?
Ready? Okay, I'm ready.
You ask them. It's so simple, but nobody wants to do it. They're afraid to have these conversations with their clients because they're afraid of what they might hear. No, that you need to hear exactly. Not only is it going to help you serve that client better, it's going to help you find more clients like that person. So when I was working for a larger agency and we were working with very large companies, the best research we ever got was what they call qualitative research. And that's when you sit in a room with people, either one-on-one or one in maybe a room of 10, and you have conversations. You don't have them fill out a survey. That's quantitative research. Surveys tell you broad trends, but they don't tell you intimate things like, why would you say that? They don't ask secondary questions in an effective way. So you told me something that I wasn't expecting to hear. Can we go down that road? Right? A survey doesn't know that typically. So qualitative research is, I think, the most effective form of understanding the market, whether you're a big company like Coca-Cola or you're a small company like a Mighty Underdog, right? Just ask the people. And you probably have a few clients that started out as either friendships or family. I mean, that's typically how entrepreneurs get started. Those are the people that you can ask. They'll be honest with you, but they won't be as honest with you as somebody who who doesn't have your success baked into their own sort of prejudices. Mom is going to want to root for you and tell you what you want to hear, but you've probably got some secondary level of customers that maybe have evolved into friendships that are going to be more honest with you. But again, that big secret is just ask them.
Right.
They'll tell you.
And recognize that it's just feedback. It's not acceptance or rejection. I mean, you're doing actually marketing research. It's kind of like a one-on-one focus group, or you can get a collection of your friends and, feed them alcoholic beverages and say, talk about me, right?
Exactly. Right. And then if you do that effectively, you can start to see how this becomes easier, because now the ideal market, right? The target, that ideal client or customer, you heard directly from them what motivates them to either buy from you or buy from somebody else. And then you start to create these, what we call, again, fancy pants term, buyer persona, or you could call them lookalikes. You could call them archetypes. You could create characters in a movie and say, and
avatars,
right. And if it's John, who's 52 years old, and who is looking to hire a marketing consultant. We understand why they're looking to hire a marketing consultant, because they can't figure out where they should start or what they should do. All of these things. Now, I know a typical John, 52 years old, male, I know that they're probably not spending a ton of time on TikTok. They're probably not very active in Clubhouse. They may use Facebook, but they're probably not doing it much for work. Where does an entrepreneur of this type tend to spend most of their time? And I could start to whittle away all of the things that aren't going to be effective that I told myself I had to do when I had FOMO. I'm using this hypothetical, but let's say, we're getting down to where he spends his most of his time is either on LinkedIn, right?
Mhm.
Or maybe this person goes to a ton of conferences. Whatever it is, you start to see that you can give yourself permission to whittle away the things that aren't going to be effective in communicating with John and focus on the things that will be the most effective. And that confidence is what I say is how you earn over time this permission to say, I'm not going to do everything. I'm going to do the one thing that finds me more Johns.
That's correct. And so one of the things that may help you find that right customer is actually specializing, being in a niche space, as opposed to, as what you say, boiling the ocean. So talk about that, because that really is, different, because I know I'm like 2 miles wide and an inch deep, and you're suggesting that we go the other way, be an inch wide and 2 miles deep.
Yeah.
So talk about that.
Well, I'll use my friend Jay Harrington as an example. So Jay Harrington owns a marketing agency. If you squinted, you would say, okay, it's a marketing agency. But there's two ways that you can niche down, I think. There's vertical niching and then there's horizontal niching. So vertical niching means, does Jay Harrington have a marketing agency that serves everybody? His marketing agency only serves law firms and attorneys. So if his target market is either somebody who is the CMO at a large law firm, or maybe it's just a sole practitioner, in that attorney or that CMO is evaluating marketing agencies, and they come across Harrington and they come across a generalist agency that may or may not serve law firms, who do you think they're going to have more confidence in to execute on their behalf? So that's the vertical niching. So you say, I'm not a marketing agency in this example for everyone. I'm a marketing agency for these specific people. Now, a horizontal niche, as we've been talking about in the marketing industry, there's all sorts of marketing that you could do, right? There's traditional advertising, there's content marketing, there's social media marketing, there's direct mail, there's email marketing. It goes on and on and on and on. You could be full service for law firms and attorneys in this example. Or as Jay Harrington does, you could say, I only specialize in thought leadership content marketing for attorneys and law firms. I don't do social media. I don't do AdWords. I don't do any of the other stuff. I help you create thought leadership content to establish your authority and broaden your level of trust within your constituencies. And I only do it for lawyers and law firms. Now that is super niche, right? But the more you niche down, the more you become that specialist who says, like if you're going, just use this example, I'll speak for myself. I don't want to ask you this question. For myself, if I get a diagnosis that I need a tumor removed from my brain, do I want the best generalist out there, or do I want the highly specialized brain surgeon that's all they do is they spend their time removing tumors from brains? I mean, it's obvious and it's an extreme example, but the same goes for marketing. And again, that starts to whittle away at all this FOMO that you're having. You don't have to be everything. In fact, I would argue that the generalist might be applicable to more use cases, but they're not going to drive the premiums that a lot of entrepreneurs want, right? When you're hiring a specialist, you expect that there's going to be a cost premium associated with getting that level of expertise, specialized in your industry or your need, and you're willing to pay for it. So that's how you move away from being the commodity to more of a rarity, which is, I think, what people want to do.
Correct. And so, but what you talked about there is really being a thought leader, actually being on the cutting edge and sharing that information and building trust with your prospects or your clients, right? And so it's being in a position of leadership and then developing content that reflects that level of knowledge, that level of expertise.
Yeah, that's right. In going back to the proliferation of channels and how we become bombarded over time, um, much of what we get bombarded with are marketing overtures, pitches. Right, we get to the point where we're really conditioning ourselves to tune out the pitch. We fast forward past commercials, right? When you see an ad in your social media feed, it's pretty obvious that it's an ad and it's easy to skim by it. Think about when you flip through a magazine, right? You flip from article to article, your eyes probably don't even make contact with the ads. So we're being conditioned to overcome those sort of overtures to pitch a product or a service. And what we're craving more and more, I think, in most industries, and is answers and great content and expertise. And I think that's where a thought leader wants to live, kind of in that space, not an ad that makes some sort of promise, a brand promise that is impossible for the person on the other end of it to trust, because you can't, trust is earned. It's not bought on the cheap. So yes, to your point, is I think more and more for entrepreneurs, again, this is industry specific, but it's more effective to share expertise and to get that out into the world so that people understand who you are, why you exist, and where the alignment is between their pain points and what you have to offer. And more, last thing on this is that, especially in the B2B space, which is where I live, is that we think, the traditional line of thinking is that marketing or advertising puts a buyer, quote unquote, in market. When usually that's not the case in B2B. Usually the buyer puts themselves in market. And what you want to do is your marketing should have been conditioning that prospect for months and months and months and months, that when they are in market, they consider you as the solution provider, and only you, because you've spent your time with thought leadership, earning their trust, and skipping some of the steps that another, a competitor might have to go through, and probably can't at short notice. Probably can't earn the trust and the authority that you've built over months and months and months. And that's how a typical B2B buying cycle goes. And there's not a whole lot you can do to change that as the marketer. So I always say that if you could align your marketing activities with the market's buying behaviors, then that's a secret sauce.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting that you talk about the B2B, because what you have in a B2B is you have the buyer, the actual buyer, and then you have the end consumer, right? And a lot of people make the mistake of selling to the end consumer and not the buyer. And so I'm totally in agreement with you that it is a process. It really is a socialization, because, we go to trade shows, FaceTime is important. We send people stuff saying, think you'll find this interesting. So you build this relationship, you build this trust, you understand and you recognize their pain points and say, I hear that this is what's happening. Here's how I can help you. Those kinds of ongoing things that you talk about. And that's really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's to your earlier point, I think you need to understand that there's a lot of different going back to the archetypes that I said when you create this movie, there's a lot of different characters in this cast. Typically, when there's a purchasing decision, there's the ultimate authority, the purchaser, right? There is a lot of times there's a shopper who's acting on that purchaser's behalf. So you might think of, say, I have an architect firm who historically the person who would hire the architect is the developer of the project, right? But oftentimes the developer of the project says, you know what, we're going to, we want a new design ethos for this new project we're thinking about. And they hand off to even an administrative assistant, find me 10 architect firms that, right? So they're the shopper. They're out there Googling. They don't know anything nearly as much as the ultimate buyer does. And so they're coming at it from, I don't mean this in the pejorative, but an uneducated viewpoint. And you need to know that maybe you need to influence that person. And then there's a lot of times there's what I call the champion So this is the person who has no buying authority, but this is the person who is the user maybe, and it's experiencing some pain point. Think of a technology company, it's real cumbersome to work in Excel, say, and then I discover that my peer at this other company or competitor is using the sophisticated software that makes it super easy and super flashy. I want this. So now that person is the champion. And so is the champion the person that you need to influence? And I'm not trying to make things more technical, but I'm trying to get people, as you suggest, to kind of open their eyes to truly understanding who it is that they need to influence. And like you said, it's not always the ultimate authority. It's somewhere else in this cast of characters.
Absolutely right. So talk a little bit about something that I find fascinating in your book, which is content as business development. Because I think business development is face-to-face, is glad handing, talking on the phone, but you have a whole different view of that. Yeah. Say more about that.
Yeah, well, in my industry, it's a familiar moniker for a type of marketing is content marketing, which is somewhat like we talked about it, sharing content. Content can be a lot of different things. It can be blog posts, it can be video, it can be a podcast like this. Content marketing. So you're in the business of creating content to create exposure for yourself, again, to establish yourself as an authority, as a viable expert, thought leader, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's sort of we're starting from ourselves at the center, and we're broadcasting content out. Very effective. And I advocate for that in many cases, but there's a counterpart to it. There's this business development aspect of things that I call content business development, where you're still using that content, but instead of the spray and pray approach, or in addition to the spray and pray approach, you're using content as a direct conduit to a prospect, either that you're acquiring as a prospect or that you're nurturing as a prospect. I'll give you two examples. So a podcast, for example, I have a number of podcasts that I run for clients. I produce, sometimes co-host. And I had a client that used their podcast not to build an audience whatsoever. They didn't care if anyone was listening to the podcast. What they wanted to do is they established the first of its kind platform in a very specialized niche industry. And this is an attorney client of mine. Their client is it's a very specific title holder at, say, Liberty Mutual Insurance, these big insurance companies. Tough to get into some big, huge company. And what he found was, this is his strategy that he sort of stole from us, which is if I call, Mary Coleman at this insurance agency and I ask her to lunch, she's going to be too busy for that. She knows I'm trying to sell her something. But if I call her and ask her to be a guest on my podcast and position her as the authority, she's going to be flattered. She'll likely take me up on that offer, and it won't appear as though it's a pitch. And then when I get her on the podcast, we're going to have a natural conversation. We're going to form a relationship, and over time, maybe that could lead to something that an invitation to lunch or coffee might not, especially nowadays where, for the past 2 years, people are kind of eschewing those invitations. So you're using your content platform to do what business development did 5-10 years ago, to open doors and start relationships. The other thing it could do, pretend you have a prospect that you're nurturing, is you could use a piece of content not to blast out via, your marketing email or on social media, but let's say you have a prospect you're nurturing and you really understand their pain point, and God, it's the one you hear all the time from your clients, and maybe you've written an article about this. And instead of following up with an email that says, hey, I really enjoyed lunch, let me know what next steps might be, you can offer them a piece of content and say, hey, Mary, we had a great conversation the other day. It got me to thinking about something I wrote on another client of mine years ago. Here's the article. So now you're giving value, right? And you're not asking for anything. You're providing something, and it just totally changes the dynamic, and it endears you to the person on the other end. You could do, use content to make an invitation to somebody, like I said, appear on the podcast, or how about present together at a conference or co-author a piece that you're going to pitch together. It's a great tool if you're active in content to not only use content from a marketing purpose, but use it for business development activity as well, one-to-one, in addition to or opposed to one-to-many.
That's perfect. That's perfect. So we've given a lot of information to our audience out there, all of our mighty underdogs, and our mighty underdogs are existing business owners who've been in operation from like 3 to 10 years, have fewer than 10 employees, and aspire to the 7 figures that you put out in your book. That's why we're here. And so before we leave this, what other pieces of advice, Tom, would you give to an entrepreneur who's listening and who feels overwhelmed and isn't quite sure what to do? What would you say?
I would say the first thing, I'm going to make another book recommendation, because the 7-figure reference that I use in the subtitle of my book and that you mentioned is actually something that I credit in the book to Brian Clark. So Brian Clark, if you don't know who he is, he's a 7-figure entrepreneur himself. He's built a number of 7-figure businesses that he's had successful exits from. And he is now creating a methodology for what he truly believes is the future of entrepreneurship, which is a mindset shift away from I need to create, a 30-person, 300-person company in order to achieve 7 figures. But how you can do that is either a solopreneur or as a small business owner. And so the book I would recommend, I would Google 7-figure small. I beg your pardon, it's not a book. It's more of an educational community, and something called Unemployable. If you Google Brian Clark, unemployable.com, I think it is, 7-figure small, you'll start to learn some of these methodologies that I think, at least for me, gave me, I don't know if confidence is the right word, but it reoriented my thinking about how am I going to build a business for myself. So without getting into too much detail, that's a place I would start. And then, of course, if the marketing specifically is your challenge, then do less, sell more is a book that you can start. I do have a free audio course that I walk people through some of the concepts in this book. And it's a newsletter that I've created. It's called the Fix Newsletter. And the idea behind it is to fix broken marketing systems. So if you go to thefixnewsletter.com, sign up, you'll get that free audio course sent directly to you.
Terrific. And you also have a website, tomnixonbooks.com.
Yes.
And that contains a number of resources, not just yours.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. So I am, in addition to being a marketing geek, I'm something of a aspiring author. So you'll see this nonfiction book, but you'll see a fiction work of mine as well. So love for people to check that out. So
yeah, terrific. So we're going to have Tom as our featured speaker at our Mighty Underdogs Lunch and Learn event at Incubizo in Ferndale on July 27th. It starts at 11 o'clock. Tom is our featured speaker. He's going to talk about these same concepts. And then we're going to have lunch and we're going to network with other business owners, who also aspire to be, if not solo entrepreneurs, small business owners with 7 figures.
Yes, sir.
So, Tom, thank you very much. This was very informative. We really appreciate it. And this is not going to be our last conversation. So we're pleased and delighted to have you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And good to be back on the mic with you, Armando.
Likewise. Right. We'll talk soon. And thank you very much for listening to this Mighty Underdogs podcast. And we will see you again or talk to you again soon.